A strange morning. The morning of September 15, 2022, seemed like any other in Pine Creek, Oregon. The small, picturesque town with its tree-lined streets and vintage lampposts was just starting to wake up. The hum of sprinklers broke the morning silence as early risers went about their rituals. The sun was barely kissing the horizon when Mary Jefferson, an elderly but sharp-eyed widow who lived across the street from Emily Drake's house, noticed something off. It began subtly, the kind of detail you'd brush aside under normal circumstances. Emily's white sedan was still parked in the driveway. Usually, by this time of day, its absence would be a reliable sign of Emily having left for work at Pine Creek High School. But today, her car just sat there. Its presence wasn't odd by itself, perhaps she had taken a rare day off. However, the house was uncharacteristically quiet with no signs of movement visible through the kitchen window where Emily often prepared breakfast for her two kids. Mary, already sipping her morning coffee, peered out of her lace-curtained window, a slightly uneasy feeling settling into her chest. Something didn't add up. Emily, known for her punctuality and busy routine, had always been a predictable presence in the neighborhood. On mornings like this, Mary would often wave at her while Emily placed her young children in the car before heading off to begin their day. As Mary set her mug down and leaned closer to the window, something else caught her attention. A streak on Emily's front porch. Narrowing her eyes, Mary squinted harder, trying to make sense of the dark, smeared streak that marred the otherwise spotless wooden floorboards of the front steps. Her gut instinct screamed red flag. The smear was not dark enough to be oil but eerily similar to dried blood. Perhaps it was nothing, Mary thought to herself. Pine Creek was the kind of town where rule-breaking rarely went beyond a parking ticket. But the nervous grandfather clock ticking loudly in Mary's hallway betrayed her growing apprehension. Battling an uneasy sense of foreboding, Mary decided to investigate, convincing herself that she was simply being a good neighbor. Clutching her cardigan tightly around her shoulders, she hesitated for a moment before crossing the street. Her slippers shuffled against the concrete sidewalk as the sound of birds chirping in the distance contrasted sharply with the eerie stillness around Emily's house. Everything appeared just as it should. The rose bushes along the driveway, meticulously trimmed, and the black mailbox with Drake, etched prominently in gold, seemed as ordinary as ever. Yet, as Mary climbed the front steps, her breath caught. From this close, the smear now looked unmistakably like blood. It formed a faint trail leading nowhere. Mary felt her heart pounding against her ribcage, her earlier curiosity now laced with tension. "Emily!" Mary called out, her voice trembling against the crisp Oregon air. She knocked on the door, first softly, then harder. "Emily, it's Mary! Everything okay in there?" she added, now pressing her ear to the door. No answer. Mary glanced down again at the blood-like smear and stepped back, suddenly uneasy about standing too close to the door. Had there been an accident? Or worse? As she took a step back, something chillingly subtle caught the edge of her vision. The curtains in Emily's living room were drawn. Not entirely unusual, but peculiar given that they were always open to let in the morning light. An inexplicable hush settled over the street, heightening her anxiety. Mary felt torn between heading back to her house to call for help, or simply brushing this off as a misunderstanding. But then she noticed another eerie detail that confirmed her instincts. One of Emily's sneakers, caked with mud and streaked in red, was lying haphazardly by the edge of the front steps. It was as though someone had left abruptly, or in a panic. "That's it," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely steady now. With shaking hands, Mary fumbled for her phone from the pocket of her jeans and dialed the Pine Creek police station. "Officer Bell's office, what's your emergency?" answered a calm female voice on the other end. "This is Mary Jefferson on Green Ridge Avenue," Mary began, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong at Emily's house. Her car's here, but I think there's blood on her porch. No one's answering the door." "Ma'am, stay where you are. We're dispatching an officer immediately. Do not approach the property or disturb anything," replied the dispatcher firmly. As Mary nodded silently, even though the dispatcher couldn't see her, she backed away from the house and crossed the street once more, her every step weighed down by a gut-wrenching fear she'd never felt before. Clutching her cardigan more tightly, she glanced nervously over her shoulder toward Emily's house, now a surreal backdrop to what was beginning to feel like a scene from a nightmare. Minutes later, the unmistakable sound of sirens echoed through the peaceful town. A patrol car sped down the street, its red and blue lights slicing through the early morning tranquility. Mary stood frozen in her yard, watching as two officers stepped out of the car, their expressions turning grim when their eyes fell on the bloodied smear and abandoned shoe. By now, Mary's heart was racing, the morning coffee in her stomach threatening to come back up. She hadn't been sure of what she'd find when she came outside, but whatever scene awaited behind that door, Mary Jefferson knew in her heart it would change Pine Creek forever. A horrific family tragedy. When the police arrived at Emily Drake's house on Greenridge Avenue shortly after receiving Mary Jefferson's urgent call, the picturesque street was already pulling itself into steady motion for the day. However, the quiet normalcy of Pine Creek was about to be shattered. Officer Bell, a seasoned veteran of the small Pine Creek Police Department, stepped out of the cruiser first. Her partner, Officer Reed, followed closely behind, already scanning the scene with a sense of alertness that didn't match the peaceful surroundings. Bell's eyes immediately fixed on the smudged, dark streak leading up the steps. She crouched down to examine it more closely. "Looks like blood," she muttered under her breath. Reed leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowing. "Doesn't look fresh," he added, his voice heavy. They both turned toward the house. From the outside nothing seemed overtly disturbed. The curtains were drawn, the front door was shut, and the living room window reflected the soft light of the overcast sky. But the uneasy feeling in the air was unmistakable. "Let's secure the perimeter first," Bell ordered. Reed nodded and walked around the side of the house, checking windows in the backyard while Bell approached the front door. She knocked firmly and called out, "Pine Creek Police Department! Emily Drake, are you home?" No response. Bell knocked again, harder this time, her voice raising just slightly. "Emily, this is Officer Bell with Pine Creek PD. If you're in there, please respond." Silence. It didn't take long before Reed returned to meet her at the door. "All windows are closed and locked, blinds drawn tight," he reported. "No sign of forced entry, no other movement from what I can tell." Bell hesitated for a moment. Something about the stillness unsettled her deeply, like the house was holding its breath. "We're not waiting," she finally said, pulling her flashlight from her belt. Reed didn't question her. After a brief moment of prying and forced maneuvering, the officers cracked the front door open. Almost immediately, an overwhelming metallic scent filled the air. It hit them like a wall, and Bell instinctively pulled her jacket over her nose. "Jesus," Reed whispered, his voice barely audible over his sharp intake of breath. "That's blood!" Bell interrupted, her throat tightening. As the door swung further open, sunlight spilling inside illuminated the scene. A nightmare painted all across the Drake family's living room. Lying on the floor in plain sight were two bodies. The first was a man, mid-30s, sprawled near the coffee table with his body angled toward the couch. Red soaked through his white shirt, the blood pooling around him now darkened to a deep scarlet sheen. The second body was a woman, face down near the base of the couch, her hair fanned out across the wooden floor like a dark halo. Her hand was stretched toward something, maybe for help, maybe for defense. It broke Bell's heart either way. "Emily Drake," Bell whispered under her breath, recognizing the woman immediately from neighborhood events and school assemblies. Reed had already stepped into the room cautiously, his flashlight sweeping across the walls and furniture. A picture frame hung crookedly on the far wall, a ceramic vase laid shattered near the TV stand. Signs of struggle were everywhere. Chairs overturned, a sofa cushion knocked to the floor, and bloody handprints on the hardwood floor speaking of futile attempts to survive whatever hell had unfolded here. Bell took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Reed, go room by room, be careful," she ordered, voice tight but focused. He nodded and headed toward the hallway. Bell moved closer to the bodies, her eyes scanning them for any trace of what might have happened. Something on the coffee table caught her attention. A set of child-sized drawings, some featuring stick figures and a family with what appeared to be a dog. Her stomach sank further. Reed's voice suddenly erupted from the back of the house. "Bell!" Bell's heart leapt into her throat and she rushed toward the hallway where Reed's shout had come from. She found him standing in a small bedroom, his face pale and his breathing visibly labored. There on the small twin bed lay another body, a young girl no older than 7. Her tiny frame was still, her blonde hair matted with blood. The pink pajamas she wore were splattered with the same haunting crimson blotches that painted the entire scene. Next to her bed, a unicorn plushie sat propped awkwardly against the headboard, untouched, as though silently mourning. Bell stood frozen for a long moment, unable to look away. In her years on the force, she had dealt with car accidents, domestic disputes, even a bar fight or two. But this? A child lying so still? It broke her in a way she hadn't expected. "We've got another one here," Reed called again, his tone dropping further into shock. Bell followed him to the next room, the bathroom. A boy, maybe around 10 years old, was crouched in the corner. His lifeless eyes stared upward at nothing. His small hands, streaked with blood, were pressed to his chest as if he'd tried to shield himself from the inevitable. Belle backed out of the bathroom as her throat closed up. She needed to breathe. This wasn't just a break-in. This wasn't just rage, she whispered to herself, trying to process. This is something else. Reed came to stand beside her, his flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. Who the hell could do this to kids? Belle didn't answer because there wasn't a real answer. Nothing that could make sense of the monstrosity in front of them. Taking a moment to regain composure, Belle stepped back into the living room to start the process of documenting everything. Emergency responders were already on their way, and Belle knew the forensics team would have to comb over every inch of the house. But she couldn't shake the lingering question, why? Why this family? As the sound of approaching sirens edged closer to the house, Belle's mind raced through every possibility. Domestic violence gone horribly wrong, revenge, a stranger's insanity. She wouldn't rest until they had answers. Still, another thought loomed in the back of her mind as her eyes settled on the drawings on the coffee table again. Had these innocents, this family, seen the monster that had come into their home that night? If they had screamed for help, no one came. This was Pine Creek. This wasn't supposed to happen here, but it had. The first clue. The crime scene was too quiet. Officer Belle stood by the living room window, glancing over the array of forensic tools being unpacked by the tech team. She wasn't sure if it was the eerie silence or the chilling nature of the murders, but something felt frozen in the air, like the whole house was holding its breath. Reed knelt by a blood-stained area near the kitchen, carefully documenting the spatter pattern. As the two officers observed their surroundings, the picture of what may have transpired began to come into focus. But it wasn't the gore or the horrors on display that first caught Belle's sharp eye. It was something oddly ordinary, a muddy sneaker lying near the edge of the kitchen counter, standing out in a landscape of chaos. At first glance, it looked like just another forgotten piece of footwear, possibly belonging to one of the kids. Yet, upon closer examination, the sneaker didn't fit with anything else in the house. "Reed, check this out!" Belle called, pointing toward the lone shoe. Reed straightened, wiping his forehead with his sleeve before walking over. They crouched together, inspecting the item more carefully. "It's covered in dried mud," Belle remarked while slipping on a pair of gloves. Carefully she picked up the sneaker, rotating it to get a better look at the sole. Mud caked its base, but what stood out more were faint streaks of red on the side, what looked like smeared blood. "Definitely too big to belong to Jacob or Maddie," Reed said, referencing the children. Belle nodded in agreement. "Looks like it belongs to an adult. Size 11 maybe?" "Could be Adam's then," Reed suggested, standing up and pacing to the other side of the counter to check for any nearby belongings. Belle frowned. "Unlikely. He was wearing loafers when we found him. Besides, this sneaker doesn't match anything Emily would wear either. It's more rugged, like something for hiking or outdoor work. I don't think any of the victims owned this shoe." Reed stopped and turned toward her, realization dawning in his expression. "You're saying this could be the killers?" "Maybe," Belle said cautiously. "But let's not jump to conclusions." She held the sneaker closer to the light, examining its design. Beyond the mud and blood there were distinctive scuff marks around the heel, a sign of heavy use. Something about the wear pattern gave Belle the sense that the sneaker had been walked in for hours, maybe miles. Reed pointed to the door leading to the backyard. "If it's not theirs and the killer dumped it, maybe it came from outside. The mud could be from the woods or one of the trails behind the houses." Belle gave a curt nod and handed the sneaker off to one of the forensic techs. "Get this bagged and sent to the lab. We'll need to see if there's any DNA inside or on the seams. Even the mud could tell us something. What area it's from, how fresh it is." The tech nodded and carefully placed the sneaker into an evidence bag. "All right," Belle said, glancing toward Reed. "Let's check the rest of the house for anything else out of place. If this belongs to the killer, they might have left more behind than just a shoe." As they moved through the house again, the narrative started piecing together in Belle's mind. The lack of forced entry suggested either the perpetrator had been let in willingly, or that they had access to the home, someone the victims knew. But the shoe complicated the narrative. If it was indeed the killers, why would they leave it behind? Was it a misstep made in panic or a deliberate act to mislead investigators? Reed's voice broke Belle's train of thought as he called from the hallway. "Hey, I think we might have found more." Belle joined him near the doorway to the children's bedroom. There, faint and uneven, was a trail of the same muddy footprints leading toward the bathroom. "It's faint, but it matches," Reed said, gesturing to one clearly imprinted mark a few feet ahead. Belle crouched down, tracing the path with her eyes. They didn't bother cleaning up. Either they didn't have time, or they didn't care if they left traces behind. A thought nagged at her as she followed the trail, ending near the bathroom sink where droplets of water had dried into faint patterns on the floor and counter. "Looks like someone washed their hands," Belle murmured, leaning closer. The light above the mirror illuminated faint streaks of red circling the drain. "Or tried to," Reed added grimly. Belle stood, gesturing toward another tech. "We'll need samples from the sink basin and any leftover residue on the faucet. Whoever stood here wasn't in much of a hurry, were they?" Reed scratched his chin, his tone shifting. "If this is our guy, do you think they wanted us to find this? The shoe, the sink? It almost feels like breadcrumbs." "Maybe," Belle said, turning back toward the hallway. "Or maybe they panicked. Either way, we've got a partial story here. It's our job to write the rest." The shoe, the muddy trail, and the blood in the sink were starting to paint a picture, albeit incomplete. But Belle couldn't ignore the feeling settling at the back of her mind, a subtle unease that whoever did this wasn't far. Outside, more officers had started canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses. From her vantage point in the hallway, Belle glanced through a window to see Mary Jefferson still standing on her porch across the street, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched, her face pale. Belle didn't blame her. She felt the same unease, the same sense of something unfinished, and as she stared at the lone evidence bag containing the shoe being loaded into the police van, Belle knew one thing for sure. If the killer left something behind, it wouldn't be long before they revealed even more. Like it or not, the trail had begun. It was only a matter of time before the rest would come into sharp focus. The contradictory testimony from Victor Lewis arrived at the Greystone Police Department later that evening, hours after Jordan Parker's uneasy interview. Unlike Jordan, Victor didn't seem as anxious upon entering the station. The former real estate agent appeared calm, even defiant, as if the mere idea of being a suspect in Melissa Harper's death was preposterous to him. With his pressed navy blazer and perfectly combed dark hair, he looked more prepared for a negotiation than an interrogation. Detective Evelyn Carson, not one to be swayed by appearances, sized him up as he took a seat in the same dimly lit interrogation room where Jordan had been hours before. Victor lounged back in the chair, his posture more confident than the circumstances warranted, though his dark eyes held an icy mix of frustration and something harder to pinpoint. Regret, perhaps? "Mr. Lewis," Carson started, her voice calm but firm, "thank you for coming in today. I understand confronting this situation must be difficult." "I'm happy to help," Victor interrupted smoothly, his tone betraying no hint of real grief. "Though I have to admit, Detective, I don't understand why I'm even here. Melissa and I had a history, sure, but that ended months ago." Carson didn't flinch at his rehearsed response. "We're speaking with everyone who was close to Miss Harper. This is standard procedure." Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Of course. I want to see justice served as much as anyone. Melissa didn't deserve—" His voice caught slightly, the first fracture in his confident facade. "She didn't deserve what happened." "That's why we're here," Carson replied evenly. "Let's start at the beginning. When did you last see Melissa?" Victor hesitated. It was subtle, but Carson caught it immediately. He broke eye contact, looking briefly at the table as he answered. "Last night, around midnight, I stopped by her house." "Why?" Carson asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "I wanted to talk to her," Victor admitted. "To apologize, maybe clear the air between us. Things ended, well, they didn't end as cleanly as I would have liked." Carson tilted her head, her tone remaining neutral. "By clear the air, do you mean you wanted to rekindle things?" "No," Victor said quickly, but his slight frown suggested otherwise. "I know Melissa had moved on. I've moved on too. This wasn't about getting back together. It was about closure. I thought we both needed it." Carson scribbled a note, glancing back up at him. "What happened when you arrived at her house?" Victor shifted in his chair, breaking the calm demeanor he'd carried before. "I knocked. No one answered right away. The porch light was on and I could see shadows moving inside. Eventually, Jordan opened the door." "Jordan Parker?" Carson clarified, her pen stopping mid-note. "Melissa's best friend?" "Yes," Victor replied, his jaw tightening slightly. He looked unsettled, sweaty, like he'd been pacing or something. I thought it was odd, but before I could ask anything, he told me to leave. "Did you see Melissa?" Carson pressed. Not at first, Victor said, his tone steady. But as I looked past Jordan I could see her. She was on the floor, in the living room. It was horrifying. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. There was blood everywhere. Carson's pen paused on the page. She leaned forward slightly, her professional mask hiding the unease brewing in her gut. So you're saying Melissa was already dead when you arrived? Yes, Victor said firmly. That's exactly what I'm saying. It was Jordan. He must have done it. Carson raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but pointed. You're accusing Mr. Parker? What makes you so certain? Because he was there, standing over her, Victor snapped, his composure slipping. And because of the way he acted, nervous, jumpy, like he'd been caught. He tried to shut the door on me, but I wouldn't let him. I demanded to know what happened, and he just kept saying, "You need to leave," over and over. Carson leaned back, letting a moment of silence hang in the air before she spoke. What did you do next? I left, Victor admitted, his voice quieter now. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but then I realized, with our history, I'd automatically be a suspect. And look, here I am. Carson studied his face, her sharp eyes searching for cracks in his explanation. So, you went home? Did anyone see you after you left? Victor hesitated, his confidence faltering again. No, I didn't see anyone. I went straight home and I stayed there. Alone? Carson asked, her tone neutral but probing. Yes, alone, Victor replied defensively. I've got nothing to hide, Detective. Melissa meant a lot to me. I'd never hurt her? Carson interrupted, her gaze locking with his. For the first time, Victor seemed genuinely unnerved. His lips parted, but no words came immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was quieter, less sure. Yes, I'd never hurt her, Carson gestured to her notepad, where she'd been meticulously recording his responses. You said Jordan was acting nervous when you arrived. Did he say anything about what had happened to Melissa? He didn't have to, Victor replied quickly. It was obvious, he was guilty. Why else would he act that way? Carson set her pen down, folding her hands on the table as she studied Victor in silence. Everything about his body language, the slight tapping of his foot, the way his hands clenched in his lap, suggested he was holding something back. But was it guilt, or just fear of being implicated? One more question, Mr. Lewis, Carson said finally. Do you know if Melissa kept a journal? Victor frowned, caught off guard by the shift in focus. Yeah, she always had one. She used to write in it all the time when we were together. Why? We found a page from it at the scene, Carson said, carefully watching his reaction. It said, "Trust him?" Does that mean anything to you? Victor blinked, his expression genuinely puzzled. Trust who? Me? Jordan? I don't know, that doesn't make any sense. Carson made a note, her expression unreadable. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. That'll be all for now. As Victor left the station, Carson couldn't shake the feeling that his story, while polished on the surface, had pieces that didn't quite fit. His insistence on Jordan's guilt felt almost rehearsed, but his reaction to the journal entry seemed genuine. Was he lying to protect himself, or had he stumbled onto a scene made to incriminate him? One thing was clear to Carson. Victor and Jordan's stories couldn't both be true. And somewhere in the tangle of lies and half-truths was the key to what really happened that night. A neighbor comes forward. By the time the police had finished securing the crime scene and begun piecing together initial evidence, word of the tragedy at Emily Drake's house had already started to ripple through the tightly knit community of Pine Creek. The sight of patrol cars, forensic vans, and the rumble of hushed conversations among gathered neighbors created an atmosphere thick with apprehension and curiosity. It was only a matter of time before someone stepped forward, and that someone was Mary Jefferson. Mary's house sat directly across the street, a perfect vantage point for someone whose daily routine included morning coffee with a side of people watching. Late that afternoon, as Bell and Reed headed toward their squad car to follow up leads, Mary called to them from her porch. She stood with her arms crossed, her usual cheerful expression replaced by a deep furrow on her forehead. "Officers!" she called out, her voice urgent but soft enough to keep things discreet. Bell turned on her heel and gave a quick nod toward Mary. "Miss Jefferson," she acknowledged, walking up the pathway, Reed close behind. "Can we help you?" The older woman gestured for the officers to step up onto her porch, lowering her voice. I didn't want to say it earlier with the whole street looking on, but I think I heard something strange last night," she said, her fingers nervously wringing the hem of her cardigan. Belle shot a glance at Reed, her interest piqued. "Strange how?" Mary hesitated for a moment as if collecting her thoughts. "I was up late reading She motioned toward the large bay window at the front of her house, and I could hear raised voices coming from Emily's house. It wasn't just her, like when she's scolding the kids. This was angrier, like an argument, a loud one. Belle pulled out her notepad and pen, immediately jotting down details. What time was this? I'd say around 9:30, maybe a little later. It was dark out, Mary replied, her voice firm in her conviction. Reed leaned forward slightly, his curiosity evident. Could you make out what they were saying? Did you hear who the voices belonged to? Mary shook her head, her lips tightening in frustration. No, I couldn't hear any specific words. It all sort of blended into muffled shouts. But one of the voices, it was definitely a man, deep, angry, and not Adam's voice. I've heard him talk plenty of times when he came by to visit. Belle scribbled this down, her pen moving swiftly. Did the argument go on for a while? No, not long, Mary said, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. Maybe 5 minutes at most. It got loud, then it just stopped all of a sudden. At first I thought maybe it was nothing, just a disagreement, But then I saw something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Belle's eyes narrowed, her tone growing sharper. What did you see, Miss Jefferson? Mary glanced toward the house across the street, as if reliving the memory. It wasn't long after the argument stopped. I saw headlights, a car backing out of Emily's driveway. Whoever it was drove off in a hurry, tires skidding just a little on the pavement like they were in a rush. I couldn't see their face, but it was a dark-colored car, maybe an SUV or a pickup. And the driver, they were tall, from what I could make out through the windshield. Reed straightened, his interest now fully locked in. Tall? Can you give us any more details about what they looked like? What they were wearing? I wish I could, Mary said, her voice heavy with regret. They had on dark clothes. That's all I could really see before the car disappeared down the road. It happened so fast and it was dark. I'm sorry I don't have more. Belle placed a reassuring hand on the porch railing, leaning a little closer. You've been a big help already, Miss Jefferson. Did you notice if the car turned onto any specific street or direction when it drove off? Mary paused, furrowing her brow in thought. It looked like they headed north, toward Fox Hollow Road, but I can't say for sure. The trees make it hard to see past the intersections at night. Belle glanced at Reed, her mind already spinning. Fox Hollow Road led toward the state highway and eventually out of town. If the driver had left the area in a hurry, it could explain why no one else had reported seeing any suspicious vehicles. Reed took a step back and scanned the surroundings briefly. Miss Jefferson, I know you said the argument didn't sound like Adam's voice and you didn't recognize the car. But is there anyone you've seen coming around recently who didn't look familiar? Anyone unusual? Mary bit her lip as if reluctant to say something and then nodded slowly. Maybe. Last week I saw a man parked in front of Emily's house. Not Adam. He looked rough, leathery face like he'd been working outside in the sun for years. Just sat in his truck for a while. Didn't get out. It struck me as odd, but I didn't think too much about it at the time. Do you remember what the truck looked like? Belle probed gently. Mary sighed. It was an old model, rusted in some places, dark green, I think. I didn't catch the plates, though. The mention of the mystery man sparked something in Belle's memory. She'd already been briefed on Emily's volatile history with Tony Wilkins, and if the man in the truck was him, it raised some serious red flags. You've been extremely helpful, Miss Jefferson, Belle said, tucking her notepad back into her coat pocket. If you remember anything else, no matter how small, please give us a call right away. Mary nodded earnestly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. I will, Officer Bell. I feel terrible for Emily and her kids. They didn't deserve this. Belle gave her a small nod, unspoken agreement in the shared weight of their emotions. As she and Reed walked back toward the car, Belle's thoughts ran wild. Reed broke the silence first. The car leaving the driveway could have been the killer running. And the argument sounds like it escalated fast. Yeah, Belle said absently, her gaze tracing the street toward Fox Hollow Road. If it was Tony, he might have been lying in wait, or he came by to confront her after dark. Either way, this adds another layer we'll need to explore. Reed opened the door to their patrol car, but paused before getting in. That man Mary described in the truck, does it sound like it matches Tony Wilkins? Belle nodded grimly. It's a solid lead. If it's him, he's got motive, opportunity, and now, a witness. As the car pulled away from Mary Jefferson's house, Belle couldn't shake the image of the headlights Mary had described vanishing into the night. Somewhere out there, the driver was already running, leaving a trail of unanswered questions, and a broken family, behind them. But with each new shred of information, Belle felt that trail getting clearer. It was only a matter of time before the pieces fell into place. From the ex-husband to another mystery. David Harris became the immediate focus of the investigation. It wasn't just his status as Emily Drake's ex-husband, known in Pine Creek for his short temper and contentious custody battle, it was also the subtle storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Officers Bell and Reed knew that when it came to crimes of this emotional magnitude, the first place to look was the inner circle, and no one had closer ties to Emily's life than David. Bell leaned over the worn wooden table in the Pine Creek Police Department's interrogation room, her eyes fixed on David, who sat a little too comfortably in his chair. His posture was relaxed, but the tension in his clenched jaw didn't go unnoticed. "David, I'm going to ask you again," Bell said firmly, tapping her pen against her notepad. "When was the last time you saw Emily?" David sighed, running his hands through his slightly graying dark hair. "I've already told you. It was last week, Friday. I came by to drop off Maddie and Jacob after my visitation weekend." His words were clipped, defensive, like every syllable was weighed carefully before being spoken. "And you had no contact with her since then? No phone calls or texts?" Reed chimed in from where he was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed casually but his presence exuding quiet scrutiny. David shook his head, clearly irritated but trying to play it cool. "No, she stopped answering my calls months ago unless they were strictly about the kids. Look, believe what you want, but I had nothing to do with this." Bell narrowed her eyes, her tone hardening. "You lost custody of your kids to Emily. Everyone in Pine Creek knows how bitter you were about that. You fought tooth and nail to get more visitation time. You even went back to court last year to try and get shared custody." "That's right," David shot back, his voice rising slightly, though he caught himself just as it reached a boil. "Because they're my kids and I deserve to see them. But fighting for my rights as a father doesn't mean I'd—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, exhaling sharply, then leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. "You think I'd do this? Kill my kids? My ex-wife?" Bell didn't flinch at the outburst. She remained calm, her piercing gaze never wavering. "We're simply trying to figure out the truth, David. Emotions can make people do things they'd never otherwise consider. And you've got a history of losing your temper, public fights with Emily, a drinking problem a few years back. You don't exactly have what I'd call an alibi on paper." David leaned back in his chair now, his voice turning icy, dripping with contempt. "I know you need someone to pin this on, but it's not me. I wasn't even in the state when it happened." Bell raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Can you prove that?" "Yes, I can," David snapped. "I was in Seattle with my sister. I drove up there Monday and stayed the week. You can ask her. Hell, you can check my credit card, gas stations, restaurants. I bought a coffee in Tacoma on Tuesday morning. Want the receipt?" Reed exchanged a glance with Bell. It wasn't what they wanted to hear, but it wasn't entirely unexpected. "All right," Reed said, his tone measured. "We'll verify that alibi. You can count on it." "Good," David said through clenched teeth. "Go ahead. And while you're at it, maybe start looking at other people in Emily's life because she had plenty of enemies, starting with that boyfriend of hers, Adam." This caught Bell's attention. She straightened her posture. "Adam Barnes? What about him?" David's expression twisted into something dark and bitter. "Oh, you all loved Adam, didn't you?" David almost spat the words. "The perfect boyfriend, the charming business guy everyone drinks beer with at his brewery, but I saw through that act." "David," Bell said firmly, "if you have something useful to share, now's the time." David's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Adam wanted to replace me, not just with Emily, but with my kids. He was doing all the fun dad stuff, family outings, barbecues, camping trips, while I fought tooth and nail for every second I got with them. He'd even drop little comments to the kids, calling himself their bonus dad." "Bonus dad?" He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think Adam was trying to push you out of the picture?" Reed asked carefully. "He didn't need to try, he already had." David leaned back in his chair now, his earlier rage smoldering into bitterness. "Emily made damn sure of that, and you know what? She did it for her new life, her new image. To hell with the guy who drove her to the hospital when Maddie was born. To hell with the guy who worked himself to the bone just to pay for that damn house." Bell scribbled notes as David ranted. One thing was becoming increasingly clear. David hated Adam. Deeply. It was the kind of hatred that simmered for years, growing thicker and heavier with each interaction. But hatred wasn't the same as murder. Bell's thoughts churned as David continued to rant. His words were dripping with resentment, sure, but his alibi held weight. If his sister corroborated his story and receipts placed him in Washington at the time of the murders, then David Harris wasn't their guy, and that left them with a chilling question. If not David, then who? After a few more pressing questions, Bell finally ended the interrogation, promising to follow up on David's Seattle alibi. Once the door shut behind him, she turned to Reed, her brow furrowed. "Well?" Reed asked, stuffing his notepad into his pocket. "I don't think it's him," Bell admitted, though her tone suggested she wasn't ready to rule him out completely. "If he's telling the truth about being in Seattle, he's cleared. But his feelings toward Adam? Those aren't going away. If nothing else, it gives us a better picture of the dynamics in Emily's life." Reed nodded. "The way he talked about Adam, he wasn't hiding that jealousy. Though I get the feeling David isn't great at hiding much of anything." Bell tapped her pen against her notepad. "Still, something's off. David doesn't strike me as the sneaky type. His anger is too loud. With him you don't get subtle moves like washing blood off your hands or sneaking a bloody shoe out of a crime scene. If this wasn't David, then we're officially back at square one and we need to dig deeper on Adam, and anyone else connected to Emily." Reed tilted his head thoughtfully. "What about Tony Wilkins? The neighbor mentioned a rough-looking guy parked outside Emily's house last week. That description doesn't match anyone we've encountered so far." "Exactly my thought," Bell said, her eyes narrowing. "If David didn't do it, that leaves Tony as our most volatile suspect. And while David might still be a bitter ex-husband, Tony, he has a history of violence, and that's the kind of thing that doesn't just vanish." With David temporarily ruled out and another shadowy figure looming, the investigation grew more tangled. In the quiet tension of the aftermath, Bell felt that familiar itch, like answers were just out of reach, waiting somewhere in the heavy silence of Pine Creek. The forensic discoveries. The forensic team at the Drake residence worked tirelessly, their precision instruments and meticulous methods peeling back layers of horror to uncover traces of the truth. For Officer Bell, who had seen crime scenes before, the technical details uncovered by the specialists carried their own kind of chill. Every clue, every bit of evidence collected, seemed to tell part of a story that desperately needed connecting. By the evening of the second day, lead forensic investigator Monica Sharp called Bell and Reed into the cordoned-off living room, where plastic tarps now covered most of the furniture. Sharp was energetic despite the grueling nature of her work, her sharp gaze flashing from one piece of evidence to the next. "You two are going to want to hear this," she said, holding up a file packed with early findings. "It's a bloody puzzle, literally, but it's starting to come together." Bell crossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. "Let's hear it. Lay it all out." Sharp began flipping through the report. First, the victims. Based on initial body temperatures and lividity, the approximate time of death for all 4 victims is between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. That gives us a fairly tight time frame to work with. Reed frowned. "That lines up with Mary Jefferson's report of hearing what sounded like an argument around 9:30. If the killer stayed longer, it means things escalated quickly after the shouting stopped." Bell nodded and gestured for Sharp to continue. "The murder weapon," Sharp said, pulling out several photos of a bloodied knife, "was found hidden under a table in the dining area. It's a standard kitchen knife, likely taken from the victim's own set." She began highlighting specific details in the photos. "We found multiple sets of fingerprints on the handle." "Multiple?" Bell asked, her tone growing sharper. "Yes," Sharp confirmed, her voice steady. "The primary set doesn't match any of the family members. However, there are faint partials, smears really, that belong to 2 of the victims, presumably from struggling or trying to grab for the blade. It suggests an intense altercation, and confirms the victims didn't go down without a fight." Reed muttered something under his breath. He'd seen the blood spatter patterns firsthand, but hearing the detailed account painted an even more visceral image in his mind. Sharp pointed to another close-up image taken of the knife handle. "We're processing the primary prints through the state and federal databases, no hits yet, but it's still early. What stands out to me, though, is this." She tapped the image of faint dark fibers clinging to the bloodied blade. "These fibers are synthetic. They appear to match the material of a glove, suggesting the killer may have partially attempted to cover their tracks." "Gloves, but fingerprints?" Reed asked, confused. "My guess," Sharp said, shrugging. "The gloves were taken off midway through or improperly worn at some point in the struggle. It's not uncommon for killers to slip up in high-stress situations." The realization of how chaotic and personal this attack must have been hung in the air for a moment before Sharp moved on. "We also ran luminol throughout the house," she said, pulling out a new set of photos. "The blood spatter you saw isn't even the half of it. Patterns indicate a lengthy and violent struggle in the living room, leading into the kitchen and back hallway." Sharp pointed to one particularly striking image of a bloody handprint smeared across the hallway wall. This is desperation. One of the victims was trying to brace themselves, maybe get away, but ultimately—" Her voice trailed off, the implication clear. Belle exhaled sharply, steels herself against the rising tension. "What about outside? Anything on the footprints?" Sharp's face brightened slightly at the mention. "Now that is something interesting. Muddy footprints were found leading out the back door and onto the patio. Based on their size and tread pattern, they belong to a men's hiking boot, consistent with the muddy sneaker you bagged earlier. So whoever left the sneaker is also our likely killer," Belle concluded, her tone firm yet grim. Sharp nodded. "The mud stuck to the soles has been sent for chemical analysis. Early results suggest it's from a creek bed, most likely from one of the trails near Fox Hollow Road." Reed interjected. "Fox Hollow. That's where Mary said the car might have headed. If the killer escaped that way, it means they could have driven straight into the woods or even camped out somewhere nearby." "It's a possibility," Sharp agreed. "But there's something more." She pulled another series of photos from beneath the file. At the sink in the bathroom, traces of blood were found, faint but present, circling the drain and around the faucet as if someone had hastily washed their hands. There were also tiny droplets leading away from the sink toward the hallway. Belle tightened her grip on the file in her hands. The killer didn't just want to clean up. They wanted to stick around. Either they were planning to leave no trace, or they were buying time. Reed's voice took on a sharper edge. "Or they panicked." Sharp nodded. "The rushed nature of the cleanup suggests panic over precision. At the same time, there's a disturbing amount of composure here too. Enough to place the knife somewhere hidden rather than leaving it out. Enough to attempt washing. This killer wasn't a total amateur. They thought about covering their tracks, but they're not a trained professional either." Belle's mind raced at the implications. Every clue seemed to paint a picture of someone who was filled with rage, but had enough control to try and think 2 steps ahead. "Anything else we're missing, Monica?" Belle asked, flipping through the dense report. Sharp paused for a moment before answering. "There's one last thing you should know," she said carefully. "We found a set of fibers on the girls' pajamas, a mix of leather and wool. It doesn't match anything in the house. Couldn't link it to anyone yet, but if I had to guess, it came from the killer's clothing." Leather and wool. It sounded rough, almost rustic. Belle scribbled a note with the phrase, "Tony Wilkins," next to it. The room fell quiet for a moment as Belle, Reed, and Sharp processed everything. The story the evidence was starting to tell wasn't just one of violence. It was one of desperation, conflict, and deeply personal betrayal. Finally Belle spoke, her voice low but resolute. "This wasn't random. Whoever did this knew the family, knew the house. They came here for a reason, and that reason is buried somewhere in Emily Drake's life." As the team dispersed, Belle knew that every detail revealed would only make this case more complex. Every bloodstain, every shoe print, every fiber, it all pointed to a tangled, emotional storm. But one thing was clear. They were inching closer to the truth, and soon the killer wouldn't be able to hide in the shadows any longer. The emergence of a third party. The presence of a third party had been looming as a possibility since the investigation began, but now it was becoming more than a hunch. It was a lead. Officer Bell and Reed hadn't yet put all the pieces together, but there was one thing they knew for sure. Someone outside of Emily Drake's immediate circle had entered her life, and their motives were darker than anyone could have predicted. It was late in the evening when the call logs finally came back from Emily's phone records. Belle was sitting in her office, nursing a black coffee that had long gone cold, when the forensic tech walked in. "We've got something interesting, Officer Bell," the tech said, placing the file down on her desk. "It's from Emily's phone. There's an outgoing call late on September 14th, 11:02 p.m. to be exact, made to a number that isn't in her contacts." Belle sat up straighter, immediately alert. "And what do we know about this number?" The tech smiled faintly. "This is where it gets interesting. The number is registered to Tony Wilkins." Belle froze for a moment, her mind flashing with the name that had been on her radar since the beginning. "Tony Wilkins," she repeated, her voice firm. "The ex-boyfriend." "You got it," the tech confirmed, "but it doesn't end there. We also pulled texts sent from this number. Let's just say, they weren't friendly." As soon as the tech left, Belle skimmed through the file, her brows knitting closer with every line she read. The messages sent to Emily from Tony over the past month told a clear story of escalating anger and frustration. One particularly chilling text stood out to her. "You think you can just erase me from your life, from everything we shared? You'll pay for this. I promise." Belle set the file down and exhaled deeply, muttering under her breath, Well, Tony, you certainly didn't keep that promise subtle. Moments later, Reed walked into the office, his own file in hand. Got something? He asked, noting Belle's intense focus. More than something, Belle replied, sliding the file across the desk to him. Emily called Tony the night of the murders, and look at these texts. It's not hard to see where his head was at. Reed flipped through the pages, his lips tightening as he read. Yikes! This guy wasn't just angry, he was spiraling. Exactly, Belle said. And given what we've already got on him, it's not far-fetched to think he acted on it. The threatening texts, the reports of him being parked outside Emily's house, the history of violence, he's checking all the wrong boxes. Reed cringed slightly at one of the texts before setting the file down. So we know he was pissed. And if the call happened at 11:02, Emily could have confronted him over the phone about something. Maybe she pushed him too far. Or, Belle countered, maybe it was the other way around. Maybe he was the one who pushed her, called, showed up at her door, and that's how it all started. Reed tapped his knuckles on the desk as he thought. How do we bring him in, though? We go knocking on his door, and if he's got half a brain cell, he'll know what's up. He already knows we're looking, Belle said, her voice slightly bitter. But there's one problem with that. Tony's nowhere to be found. Reed raised an eyebrow. What do you mean, nowhere? I mean he's gone, Belle explained. His house is empty, his truck is missing, but his neighbor saw him early the morning of September 15th, loading bags into the back of his truck before taking off. Reed leaned back in his chair. So he skips town the day the bodies are found. If that doesn't scream, I've got something to hide. I don't know what does. It gets worse, Belle added, leaning forward. Traffic cameras caught his truck heading toward the wooded areas just outside Pine Creek, Fox Hollow Road. Reed's eyes widened. Fox Hollow, that connects to the creek bed where we found the mud traces, right? The same mud on the sneaker and the prints leading out of Emily's yard? Exactly, Belle said. It's like every clue we've found so far is pointing in his direction. Tony's got a temper, he's got motive, and now he's got a trail leading straight into the woods. It's not looking good for him. Reed tilted his head thoughtfully. So what's the play? We track him down in the woods? That could take days without a clear starting point. Belle nodded. It's risky, but we've got no other choice. If Tony's running, he's either hiding or trying to figure out his next move. And the longer we wait, the further ahead he gets. She stood, grabbing her jacket off the back of her chair. Let's get a team together. If Tony's our guy, we're not letting him disappear into thin air. Within an hour, a search team was mobilized, equipped with drones, tracking dogs, and enough manpower to sweep the dense woods near Fox Hollow Road. Belle and Reed stood at the edge of the tree line as the search began, watching as officers fanned out into the night. I don't like this, Reed admitted after a moment. Guy like Tony out here in the middle of nowhere, if he's cornered, it won't end well. I don't like it either, Belle agreed, her gaze fixed on the distant glow of flashlights darting through the trees. But I like unsolved murders even less, and Tony Wilkins just moved to the top of my list. As they waited for updates from the search team, Belle replayed everything she'd learned about Tony in her mind. The failed relationship, the anger, the threatening texts. If he wasn't their guy, he sure as hell was doing a good job fitting the role. I'll tell you one thing, Belle muttered more to herself than to Reed. If we find him out there, I'm betting he's got more than just explanations to give us. The woods remained eerily quiet as the minutes dragged on, but neither Belle nor Reed wavered. Somewhere out there, they knew, was the answer to the chaos Emily Drake and her family had endured, and the man who held that answer was running out of places to hide. The manhunt for the suspect. The search for Tony Wilkins had transformed Pine Creek from a quiet, picturesque town into the epicenter of a tense and highly coordinated manhunt. What started as a chilling investigation into Emily Drake's brutal murder had now escalated into a high-stakes pursuit of a man desperate enough to flee, leaving behind a growing mountain of evidence pointing directly at him. By sunrise on September 16th, the Pine Creek Police Department, bolstered by state officers and specialized tracking teams, had mobilized their efforts into the dense, sprawling woods near Fox Hollow Road. Tony's truck had been found abandoned on a dirt trail leading into the forest, a silent signal that he had gone to ground. Standing at the edge of the woods, Belle tightened the straps on her utility belt and glanced toward Reed, who was loading a shotgun with non-lethal beanbag rounds. You really think he's still out here? Reed asked, sliding the barrel into place and giving it a testing snap. His voice betrayed a hint of doubt, though his body language showed none. He's got nowhere else to go, Belle replied, pulling on her gloves. The cameras caught his truck heading here. He's either hiding in these woods or figuring out his escape route. Either way, we have to assume he's armed and dangerous. Reed nodded, his expression grim. A guy like Tony doesn't just go quietly. If he's desperate enough to kill an entire family, he's desperate enough to do anything to stay free. Belle's face was as unmoving as stone, her eyes fixed on the tree line. Desperate killers make mistakes. They leave trails. He won't make it out without us finding him. The team split into groups of 3, each armed with thermal imaging equipment, tracking dogs and rifles in case Tony made this hunt more dangerous than anticipated. Patrol vehicles lined the edge of the woods, their flashing lights cutting faintly through the early morning fog. A drone buzzed overhead, scanning the heavily forested area for any sign of movement. "All right," Belle said to her group, her voice low but firm. "Eyes open, weapons ready. If you see him, announce yourself loud and clear. Do not approach unless you have backup." As they moved forward, a piercing silence settled over the woods, broken only by the occasional squawk of a radio or the panting of K9 units sniffing out a trail. The dense canopy above turned the sunlight into shadows, which twisted and stretched across the forest floor like something alive. "Over here!" a nearby voice crackled through Belle's radio. "We've got something!" Her heart leapt. "What is it?" she responded swiftly, already motioning for her group to head toward the source of the call. "Footprints, recent, leading deeper into the woods," confirmed the officer on the other end. "They match the tread pattern from the boot prints at Drake's property." Belle and Reed arrived at the scene within minutes, where an officer gestured toward a faint but clear trail of mud imprints. They zigzagged between clusters of trees leading further into the dense wilderness. "This guy knows these woods," Reed muttered, crouching down to inspect a print for himself. "He's not just wandering out here." Belle straightened, her sharp eyes scanning the direction of the trail ahead, which means he either grew up around here or has spent enough time out here to think he's got the upper hand. Let's remind him he's wrong. The group pressed on, following the trail. It snaked through thorny underbrush and across shallow creeks, evidence of Tony's attempt to mask his path. But every broken branch and overturned rock betrayed his movements, creating a breadcrumb trail that even the most seasoned fugitive couldn't cover completely. Over the next hour the forest seemed to grow denser, the air heavier with tension. Reed kept pace with Belle, his gaze darting between their surroundings and the trail ahead. "Think he's armed?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Absolutely," Belle replied without hesitation. "Guys like Tony don't take risks unless they think they can end it on their terms. He knows we're closing in." The sound of barking suddenly split the air, sharp and insistent. The tracking dogs were onto something. The officers exchanged tense glances before picking up their pace, their boots crunching over fallen leaves and sticks as the barking grew louder. Up ahead, one of the K9 handlers motioned toward an area of thick foliage. "We've got a heat signature," he called out. "Staying low and not moving. Could be him." Adrenaline flooded Belle's system as she raised her hand, signaling her group to fan out and surround the area. She motioned for Reed to follow close on her flank as they advanced cautiously toward the source of the heat signature. "Tony Wilkins!" Belle called out, her voice sharp and commanding, echoing through the trees. "This is the Pine Creek Police Department! Come out with your hands where we can see them! You're surrounded!" For a moment, nothing happened. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence thick and oppressive. Then from behind a cluster of rocks, a figure moved. "Don't come any closer!" a voice yelled, raw and desperate. "I swear I'll shoot!" Belle's grip on her weapon tightened, her eyes narrowing as she spotted Tony's disheveled figure partially hidden behind the rocks. His face was haggard, streaked with dirt and sweat, and one hand clutched something metallic, a pistol, its barrel gleaming in the dappled sunlight. "Tony," Belle said, her tone steady but firm, "you don't want to do this. Put the gun down and we can talk." "No talking!" Tony barked back, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. "I know what this is. You're not taking me in. Not alive." "You don't have to die here, Tony," Belle pressed, taking a slow step forward. "Whatever happened, we can sort it out. But this isn't the way." Reed raised his weapon slightly, keeping Tony in his sights. "She's right, Tony. There's no way out of this. Don't make it worse." Tony's hand trembled as he glanced wildly between Belle, Reed, and the officers fanning out around him. The desperation in his eyes was unmistakable. It was the look of a man who had lost everything and knew it. For a moment Belle thought he might actually listen. His grip on the gun slackened, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the chase was finally crushing him. But then, in a split second, his panic surged. "Stay back!" he screamed, raising the pistol in a wild arc. But before he could fully aim, the crack of a beanbag round split the air, striking Tony in the chest with enough force to knock him off balance. He collapsed to the ground, the gun skidding out of his reach. "Move in!" Belle ordered, rushing forward with Reed at her side. Officers closed the gap in seconds, pinning Tony to the ground and securing him in handcuffs. As the tension broke, Belle stood over him, her heart pounding as relief and anger fought for dominance. "You're done, Tony," she said coldly. "No more running." Tony didn't respond. He was breathing hard, his face twisted into a mix of pain and defeat. As they hauled him to his feet and began escorting him out of the woods, Belle couldn't help but glance back at the dense trees that had served as Tony's final hiding place. She knew the hard part wasn't over. Finding Tony was just the beginning. Now they'd have to unravel the full truth of what he'd done, and why. But for the first time since the murders, she felt it. They were closer to justice than ever. Tony falls into the grip of the law. The arrest of Tony Wilkins should have felt like the final victory, the moment where relief might finally begin to wash over the town of Pine Creek. But for Officers Bell and Reed, it quickly became apparent that catching Tony was only the beginning. As they transported him back to the Pine Creek Police Department for questioning, the tension in the air seemed heavier than ever. Tony sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists cuffed tightly behind him. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and defiance, his eyes fixed out the window as the dense woods gave way to open fields and eventually the quiet streets of town. Belle glanced at him from the rearview mirror. "You've got a lot to answer for, Tony," she said, her tone steady but pointed. Tony didn't respond at first, his lips pressed tight into a thin line. But then, almost as if he couldn't help himself, he muttered, "You're wasting your time." Reed raised an eyebrow, turning slightly in his seat to face Tony. "Is that so? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like we've got enough evidence to bury you." Tony let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Evidence," he said mockingly. "You people think you're smart, but you don't know a damn thing." Belle kept her eyes on the road, her grip tightening on the wheel. She knew the tactic, deflection, intimidation, the kind of bravado that criminals often use to try to reclaim some sense of control. "We know enough," she replied evenly. "We know about the threatening texts. We know you were parked outside Emily's house last week. We know your boot prints match the ones leaving the scene." Tony's head snapped up at that, his defiance flickering into something closer to panic for just a moment before he masked it again. "You think that's enough for a conviction?" he sneered, leaning forward as far as the cuffs would allow him. "You don't have squat, you're just connecting dots that don't mean anything." Reed folded his arms, his expression unimpressed. "You want to keep talking, Tony? Go ahead. Every word out of your mouth just makes this easier for us." Tony leaned back again, scowling. "Whatever, you're just like the rest of them. Bloodhounds sniffing at a trail but too dumb to know where it ends." Belle pulled into the station's parking lot, bringing the car to a smooth stop. She turned off the engine before shifting in her seat to look at Tony directly. "You want to play the tough guy? Go ahead, but here's the thing. You're not walking out of this, and the more you stall, the worse it gets for you." Tony's jaw clenched, but he didn't offer another quip this time. The officers escorted him into the station where he was processed and led into an interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above as Tony slouched into the metal chair. His hands were uncuffed but still firmly resting on the table in front of him. It was Belle who sat across from him, her notepad and files meticulously organized. Reed stood by the door, a silent but looming presence. Belle wasted no time. "Tony, you've had your fun. Now it's time to get serious. Let's start with the night of September 14th. Where were you?" Tony looked at her, his face set in an expression of practiced disinterest. "I was home," he said flatly. "Alone?" Belle asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's right," Tony replied, shrugging. "I don't live with anyone, so yeah, I was alone." Reed scoffed from his position by the door. "Convenient. No alibi, no witnesses. That's not going to help you, Tony." Tony's eyes flicked toward Reed, irritation flashing across his face. "I don't need an alibi. You don't have anything that ties me to what happened." "That's where you're wrong," Belle said, her voice calm but firm. She slid a photo across the table, a close-up of the muddy boot print found outside Emily's house. "This is yours. We matched the tread pattern to your boots. And guess what? Mud samples from the creek bed on Fox Hollow Road, right where your truck was last seen, tied directly to this print." Tony's stare hardened as he examined the picture, but he said nothing. "We also found your DNA at the scene," Belle continued. "A sweat sample from the knife handle. You can explain all you want, but science doesn't lie, Tony." The mention of DNA cracked Tony's veneer of defiance slightly. He swallowed hard, shifting in his seat, but quickly covered it up with another sneer. "You're bluffing," he said. though his voice wavered just enough to betray him. "You think we need to bluff?" Reed chimed in, stepping closer. "Tony, this isn't a bar fight or some stupid small-town grudge. This is murder. 4 people dead, including 2 children. You think a jury is going to buy your innocent act when every shred of evidence screams otherwise?" For the first time, Tony's confidence seemed to falter completely. His eyes darted between Bell and Reed, his breathing growing heavier. Reed pressed on, his voice sharp. "Why don't you save yourself what little dignity you've got left and tell us the truth? We already know why you were angry. Why you wanted to go after Emily, but, let me guess, it didn't go the way you planned, did it?" Tony slammed his hand down on the table, making Belle flinch slightly, though she refused to show it. "You don't know anything," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "Then tell us!" Belle snapped back, leaning forward. "Help us understand, Tony. You went to Emily's house. What happened?" For a long moment, the room was silent except for Tony's ragged breathing. Then finally, he slumped back in his chair, his defiance crumbling into something closer to despair. I just wanted to scare her," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Belle exchanged a quick glance with Reed before leaning forward again. "Scare her how, Tony?" "I wanted to make her listen," Tony said, staring down at his hands. "She ignored me, cut me out like I never existed. After everything we had—" He shook his head, his voice growing angrier. "She thought she could just move on with that guy, Adam. Act like I was nothing." "So you went there to scare her," Belle said, her tone carefully neutral. "And things got out of control, didn't they, Tony?" Tony's head jerked up, his eyes wide and wild. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." "What wasn't?" Belle pressed, her tone firm but trying to hold back judgment. Tony buried his face in his hands, his body trembling as the weight of his actions finally seemed to crush him. "I don't know. She screamed. The kids ran in. I panicked. His voice broke and he slammed his fists on the table. Silence stretched out in the room until Belle finally spoke, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "You didn't just kill her, Tony. You killed all of them. 2 innocent kids. Do you understand that?" Tony nodded weakly, tears streaming down his face as all the bravado from before vanished completely. For the first time since the murders, the truth was laid bare, and the weight of it was undeniable. As Belle and Reed stepped out of the room to notify the DA, the tension between them eased slightly. The case wasn't over yet, but they had the confession, and more importantly, justice for Emily Drake and her family was finally within reach. Behind the crime. The confession had given Belle and Reed what they needed to charge Tony Wilkins, but there was still one lingering question that no one could overlook. Why? What had motivated Tony, a man with no prior murder convictions, to unleash such horrifying violence on Emily's family and 2 innocent children? In the sterile gray interrogation room, Belle sat across from Tony, trying her best to leave behind the cold interrogation style she'd used earlier. What they needed now wasn't intimidation, it was information. Reed leaned against the wall, his arms casually folded, though his watchful eyes betrayed his intense focus. Belle slid a cup of water across the table toward Tony. "You said you wanted to make her listen. I need you to tell me what you meant by that." Tony, still slumped in his chair, stared at the water for a few seconds before finally picking it up. His hands shook slightly as he took a sip, his eyes glassy and unfocused. She owed me," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "Owed you what?" Belle pressed gently, keeping her tone neutral. Tony leaned back in his chair, letting out a bitter laugh that held no humor. "You wouldn't get it. You probably think I'm some jealous ex who went crazy, right? That's what everyone's gonna say." Belle exchanged a brief glance with Reed, who gave a subtle nod, urging her to keep him talking. "Help me understand," Belle said, her voice calm but firm. "What did Emily owe you?" Tony shook his head and looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment Belle thought he was going to clam up, but then he sighed heavily, the words spilling out like a dam had broken. "She needed me," Tony began, his voice uneven. "After the divorce she was a mess. That perfect little house of hers, falling apart, plumbing leaks, roof damage. She couldn't afford to fix any of it. So, what does she do? She comes to me." "She asked you for money," Reed said, more of a statement than a question. Tony shot him a sharp glance, his expression darkening. "Yeah, she knew I had some saved up and she played nice to get it. Told me it wasn't a big deal, just a loan. I'll pay you back soon, Tony," she said. But guess what? She never did. "And that's why you were angry?" Belle asked, measuring her tone carefully. "Because she didn't pay you back?" "It wasn't just about the money!" Tony snapped, slamming a fist on the table. Belle didn't flinch, keeping her calm exterior intact. "It was about what she did after I helped her, after I bailed her out. The second her house was fixed up and she didn't need my help anymore, she tossed me aside, like garbage, cut me out of her life, stopped answering my calls, acted like I didn't even exist." "Did she start seeing Adam after that?" Reed interjected, stepping closer to the table. Tony nodded bitterly, his lips curling into a sneer. "Yeah, that guy, Mr. Perfect Businessman. Do you know how that feels? I was there for her when no one else was, I bust my ass to help her out, and then she runs off with him, with his stupid brewery and his shiny cars and his fake-ass charm." Tony's voice cracked, and he buried his head in his hands. Belle leaned forward slightly. "You felt like she betrayed you." "She did betray me!" Tony shouted, looking up with raw emotion blazing in his eyes. "She made me think we had something, that maybe we could make it work again, you know? But no, I was just a step stool for her to climb back up. Then Adam comes in, playing daddy to her kids, acting like I was never even there." "Is that why you sent those texts?" Belle asked, her tone gentle but probing. "The ones where you said she'd regret it?" Tony's face twisted into a grimace as he nodded. "I wanted her to know, to feel it. What she did to me. How it tore me apart. She needed to know you can't just treat people like they're disposable." "Is that why you went there that night?" Reed pressed. "To make her regret it?" Tony hesitated before answering, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "I just wanted to talk. Scare her maybe, make her listen. But when I got there, she wouldn't even let me in. She called me a loser, a creep." His hands balled into fists as he continued, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "She said she was happy now, that I was just some guy she used to know, like I never meant anything at all." "And that's when things got out of control," Belle said softly, filling in the gaps. Tony nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. "She tried to slam the door in my face and I pushed my way in. I wasn't even thinking, I lost it. Adam came in, yelling, and then the kids were screaming." His voice broke and he covered his face with his hands. "It all happened so fast. One second I was trying to talk to her, the next—" "You were holding a knife," Reed said bluntly, his voice softer than usual. Tony's shoulders slumped, his entire body trembling as he finally let the full weight of what he'd done sink in. "I didn't mean to hurt them," he whispered through his sobs. "I swear, I didn't mean to hurt the kids, everything spun out of control and I couldn't stop it." Belle leaned back slightly, letting his words hang in the air. The room felt heavier now, suffocating in its silence. "But you did hurt them, Tony," Belle said quietly, her voice firm but not unkind. "You didn't just scare Emily. You took the lives of 2 innocent children who had nothing to do with your anger. You destroyed a family." Tony said nothing, his head bowed as the tears streamed down his face. For the first time he seemed to understand the enormity of what he had done, not just to Emily, but to her children, her new life, and to himself. Belle stood gathering her files as she prepared to leave the room. "We'll make sure the DA has everything they need," she said to Reed, though her words were as much for Tony as they were for her partner. "No one escapes the consequences of something like this." As they left the room, Reed shook his head, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I'll give him this. He's not lying about the anger, but man, that's a hell of a way to let it out." Belle nodded, her expression grave. "It wasn't just anger, Reed. It was an obsession. And when obsession goes unchecked, it destroys everything around it." They walked down the hallway in silence, each of them carrying the weight of Tony's confession. While the why behind the crime was clearer now, it was no less chilling. What had started as anger and jealousy had spiraled into unspeakable violence, a reminder of just how dangerous unchecked emotions could become. For Pine Creek, justice might soon be served, but the scars left behind by Tony's crime would take much longer to heal. Closure and the larger lessons. For Belle, the journey to justice wasn't glamorous or rewarding, it was grueling, almost suffocating in its weight. As the trial came to a close, Tony Wilkins stood at the center of the courtroom, his demeanor hollow, yet undeniably human. He had been stripped of his arrogance, reduced now to someone whose fate lay in the hands of others. For the people of Pine Creek, the trial wasn't just about finding justice for Emily Drake and her family. It became the epicenter of reflection, fear, and deeply personal heartbreak. It was a cool October morning as Belle and Reed sat outside the courthouse, cups of steaming coffee in their hands, their badges reflected dully in the sunlight. The buzz of reporters just beyond the steps seemed muted against the weight shared between the two officers. "Well," Reed said, leaning back against the cold concrete bench, "it's finally over." Belle didn't respond immediately. Her fingers tapped against her cup nervously. Is it ever really over, though? Reed shrugged. Tony's going away for good. No parole, no loopholes, life sentence, maximum security. The DA made sure of that. If that's not closure, I don't know what is. Belle let out a dry laugh, though her eyes stayed distant. Closure, huh? Try telling that to Emily's parents or those kids' grandparents. Reed nodded solemnly. Yeah, I get it. But we got him. You saw his face during the sentencing. He knows what he did. You told me once this job isn't about fixing things, it's about bringing truth to the surface, no matter how ugly it is. Belle gave a faint smile. You make me sound a lot wiser than I feel most days. But you're right about one thing, she continued after a pause, her voice quieter now. It's not just about catching the bad guy, it's the aftermath, the wake they leave behind. No matter what Tony Wilkins's punishment is, the Drake family's gone. No amount of justice can undo that. Reed stared thoughtfully at his coffee, his jaw tightening. You think it could have been prevented? That question hung heavily in the air. Belle's mind flashed to all the missed signs, the escalation of Tony's behavior, his threatening texts, his presence outside Emily's house in the weeks leading up to the murders. It was a haunting series of what-ifs that refused to go away. I think, Belle began slowly, choosing her words carefully, sometimes we ignore the warning signs because we don't want to believe people are capable of this kind of evil. It's easier to brush it off, to compartmentalize. But people like Tony don't just wake up one day and decide to destroy lives. It builds, piece by piece, escalation to escalation, until it finally explodes. And by then... It's too late, Reed finished, his voice grim. Belle nodded. Too late for Emily. Too late for Jacob and Maddie. Her voice cracked slightly but steadied quickly. Maybe that's what scares me most. Inside the courtroom, Tony's sentencing had played out exactly as the DA had promised. Guilty for 4 counts of first-degree murder, life in prison without parole. There was no dramatic scene, no movie-like outburst. Tony simply stared ahead, as though any fight left in him had already evaporated. Some in the courtroom cried quietly. Emily's mother broke down completely in the arms of her husband, but others sat in somber silence, their grief having long since transitioned into numbness. The judge's words echoed in Belle's memory as she sat alongside Reed, replaying the moment in her head. Tony Wilkins, you have committed crimes so heinous, so far removed from human decency, that society can offer no forgiveness. May you reflect every day for the rest of your life on the suffering you caused. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Reed interrupted Belle's thoughts as he traced the handle of his cup with his thumb. You ever think about what turns someone into, a Tony Wilkins? Belle considered the question. I think people like Tony start as ordinary as you and me. He felt slighted, invisible. He let anger fester. He let it turn him into something darker until he couldn't see himself anymore. By the time he showed up at Emily's door that night, he wasn't a man looking to reconcile. He was a man looking to destroy. Reed shook his head. That's what gets me. A whole family. Gone. 2 kids who had zero idea what they even walked into. Over what? Pride? Rejection? Some outdated sense of entitlement? Exactly, Belle said, her voice firm. What happened to Emily and her kids wasn't just a crime, it was a lesson. A painful, devastating lesson about what happens when people let hatred grow unchecked, when they let obsession dictate their actions. Reed exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the crisp air. You think Pine Creek learns from it? Or do we just go back to acting like stuff like this doesn't happen here? Belle gave him a look. The world doesn't stop being broken just because a tragedy shakes us. People will mourn, they'll hold their kids tighter for a while, but eventually they'll move on. That's terrifying. But it's human. She added, what matters now is that this town keeps its eyes open. It needs to remember what happened, not so it stays afraid, but so it knows how to listen, to see the warning signs the next time someone like Tony starts unraveling. Reed straightened, a faint smirk crossing his face. If you ever want to become a motivational speaker, I think I'd buy a ticket. Belle chuckled softly and finally allowed herself a small sip of her now lukewarm coffee. No thanks, I'll stick to the badge, even if it feels like it's heavier than ever. As the courthouse buzzed behind them and reporters scrambled to cover the day's headlines, Belle and Reed sat in the quiet aftermath. For both of them, the case wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about understanding it, about coming to terms with the parts of humanity that were capable of kindness and connection, but also destruction and violence. The memory of Emily Drake and her young family became more than just another story in Pine Creek. Their tragic loss stood as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked emotions, the importance of community vigilance, and the fragility of seemingly perfect lives. For Belle, the case became a reminder of the fine line between order and chaos, between justice and failure. And as they drove away from the courthouse steps that day, the faint hum of the radio filling the silence of the car, Belle knew she wouldn't forget Emily, Jacob, or Maddie. Not ever. "What do you think's next?" Reed asked, breaking the quiet. Belle leaned back against her seat, staring out the window at the town they had sworn to protect. "Hopefully, prevention, because we can't undo what happened here, but maybe, just maybe, we can make sure it never happens again." The sun dipped lower as they drove on, the weight of justice behind them and the fragile hope of tomorrow ahead.